All right, good morning. I have to admit, this is a little beyond my comfort zone, but I'm trying to be a team player. Since we planned out what the worship series would look like, I'm just trying to do my part. So here I am today to do some Bible-based illusions. For my first trick, I will pull a dove, carrying an olive branch, of course, out of my hat. Now,
wait a second, Clayton. I think you might be a little confused.
What do you mean? It says on the schedule we're talking about Bible-based illusions. And the story of the disciples discovering the Messiah, Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
But Clayton, seriously, we're talking about allusions with an A, not illusions with an I.
That's right. Unlike most Canadians, you don't gravitate towards A, do you?
That's E-H-A.
Pronounced A, pronounced A.
Gordon, do you mean that I've prepared this whole sermon about illusions when I should have been preparing about allusions?
Seriously, I'm afraid so.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, that stinks. Well, since we're a team, right? I was hoping that you might be able to help me out a bit in getting this back together, back on the right tracks. We like to say we're interchangeable, willing to be able to step in for one another when needed. So let's put that to the test here and now.
Since Gordon and I are so quick on our feet, I think we can do that. What do you have that might be applicable to today?
Well, I did notice when reading this passage that it's not just about the individual calls of the disciples. There is this really clever flow of discovering the Messiah, Jesus, of course, that they had been waiting for. Check it out on the screen here. So, John sees Jesus and proclaims that he is the Messiah. He then goes and speaks, and Andrew hears that. Then Andrew goes and tells his brother Peter. Seems to make sense. But then we see that Philip, who is from the same town as Andrew and Peter, meets Jesus. Okay, and then Philip runs into Nathanael, abbreviated as Nate, so you can still read it on the screen. And then Nathanael himself meets Jesus. There's all of these people coming together, meeting Jesus, but they're all connected to one another.
Clayton, that's right. And that's where the allusions begin. They are alluding to their common story. They are alluding to Moses, the Torah that they read. They are alluding to Jacob, the lineage that connects them to their past. And they are alluding to the fig tree, to the world around them.
And that's why we're not just talking about their individual calls. They were all interconnected, as you've shown quite nicely with your diagram. And really, that's how our experience is of our callings to follow Jesus. None of us can truly start or practice our faith alone because we're all connected. That's why we're focusing on the theme of their interpersonal discovery of the Messiah.
Which points to our own discovery of the Messiah in our interconnected lives.
So what's so significant about these illusions anyway?
Well, let's start with Moses. We've just come through the Advent season, the time of the church year when we anticipate the coming of the Messiah. This tiny baby entering the world in need of care. And in the weeks between now and beginning of the Lenten season, we'll be following the texts of the lectionary that are part of the season after Epiphany. In these stories, we will hear the call stories that Jesus had offered, the call that Jesus had offered to those who would become his disciples. These stories seem to fit well with our theme that shaped our Advent, into the world. First, it was Jesus who came into the world, and now, in turn, it is us going into the world. There's a lot of activity in the text, which you have already seen, keeping track of all of the people, the way things happened. It could seem like it's a short and choppy. story. And yet, as we saw, there was this path that emerged, and that path led to Jesus for everyone. Jesus calls to Philip. Philip found Nathanael. Jesus saw Nathanael, and in a twist, Nathanael notes that he had already seen Jesus. There's a lot of seeing and seeking going on in this passage, allusions, all of them, to this unfolding narrative that is taking shape around Jesus. But what are they really seeking? Do they even know what they're seeking? Philip seems to know. He's found him. You know the one who was talked about from old, the stories that they have heard, you know, the one that Moses spoke about. Remember, we learned about that when we were in synagogue together. The one who the prophets knew about. You remember, there was all that talk amongst the prophets. The son of Joseph, the one that would come from that little spot on the map, Nazareth. You know, the Messiah. Here was this one who had been spoken of from the past into the present, who was going to lead us into the future. The one who generations of Jewish people were waiting for to arrive. Not some, one, but the real one, the Son of David, the ruler of all. The one who would come to earth in the proper time, who would set things right and bring about this fulfillment. The one who would bring about the fulfillment of the law, Jesus, the Messiah. Now, there were many, many questions about who this Messiah would be, and there were a lot of expectations that were heaped upon the Messiah. Would he be the one to restore Israel into the nation that it was in the past? There was a lot of hope for that. Would he be the one who would bring back power and might to the Jewish people? There was an awful lot of hope for that. Would he bring back the restoration of the temple so that it could be restored and it would once again have this powerful place in the people's lives, and temple would be central in a way that it hadn't been before? There was a lot of hope for that too. He would be none of those things to the people who had waited so long for him to come. And how did they live with that disappointment? Who is the Jesus that we are waiting for? What kind of Jesus are we expecting to show up? Will it be the Jesus who will restore us to a better former self, who we were in the past? Will it be the Jesus who gives us power and wealth to make all the changes that we need in our world because we have so much to give? Will it be a Jesus who makes everything right in our lives so that no longer do we have to grapple with big questions and wonder what's going to happen? I seriously doubt it. Most likely, the Jesus who is going to show up in front of us is not the Jesus that we expect. Instead, it will be the Jesus that Jesus knows that we need. It might not be the flashy Jesus who bolts in and saves the day. It might not be the Jesus who intervenes and strikes down all the bad people in the world and takes care of injustice in one fell swoop. It might not be the Jesus who gives us everything that we've ever hoped for. Instead, it might be the Jesus who shows up and walks with us and calls us by name and asks us to follow. What kind of Jesus are you looking for?
Now I'm wondering, Clayton, if at this moment, with one of your illusions, you could make a glass of water appear.
Nope.
And so then in John, the first chapter, 51st verse, Jesus addresses Nathanael with the most important relational fact Nathanael has ever encountered. Like the allusion to Jacob in the 12th verse of the 28th chapter of the book of Genesis, where Jacob dreams of the ladder reaching from earth to heaven, where he dreams of encountering God, seeing God, seeing the angels of God ascending and descending on God's ladder to heaven. Where Jacob dreams of this ladder to God, Nathanael encounters Jesus. And in his relationship with Jesus, Nathanael discovers the opening to heaven, and Nathanael will see God's angels ascending and descending upon the Son of Man, upon Jesus. Relationship with Jesus is now the relational ladder to God, meaning that we do not climb up to God. God shuttles down to us through Jesus. Through Jesus, God finds us. God finds us relationally, in relationship. In relationships, God gives us a glimpse of heaven here on earth. Jesus shuttles between earth and heaven, establishing relationships that join the two. Relationships reminding us of where our true home is. Home in human experience is another word for heaven. I think of that, and I think of a story told by Leith Anderson, who recalls that my family and I lived in the same house for 17 years. We've lived there more than twice as long as I have lived at any other address in my entire life, he says. I'll sometimes refer to it as our house, but more often I refer to it as home. What makes it home isn't the address or the lot or the garage or the architecture. What makes it home is the people. You may live in a bigger or newer or better house than we live in, he says, but as nice as your house may be, I would never refer to your house as home because the people who are the most important to me don't live there. So what makes home home is the people in the relationships. And what makes heaven heaven is not streets made of gold, great fountains, lots of fun, and certainly no smog. That all may well be. Actually, Leith says, I think heaven is far greater than our wildest imagination. The same God who designed the best of everything in this world also designed heaven. Only God took it to a far greater extent than anything we've ever seen. And yet, that's still not what makes heaven heaven. What makes heaven heaven is God. It is being in relationship with God that makes heaven. In other words, we can all be like Nathanael. Not be so 21st century sophisticated that we cannot release, let go of our skepticism. So in the letting go, we can stop asking, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And so in the letting go, we can stop asking, in our sterile, materialistic age with its snotty certainty about what counts as real, in the letting go of this snotty skepticism, we can stop asking, can anything of heaven really be reality? And like Nathanael, we can declare, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. And the Son of God offers a whole life of relationships that take us home, that take us to heaven, take us home to God.
So I see how this works. These allusions to Moses and Jacob's ladder experience emphasize the relationship the disciples shared. Not only geographically connected, but they shared a religious history. They shared a heritage that kept them together. But there's one thing that I keep coming back to. Why did Jesus point out to Nathanael that he was under a fig tree? It seems like just a weird detail, but these biblical authors didn't just throw in random details for no reason. So I dug a little bit deeper. Fig trees actually show up all throughout the Bible, in weird places, actually, but especially in times of peace and prosperity. But this wasn't one of those times for Israel. They were occupied by Rome. They were under the heel of an oppressive group. But when we look at the whole passage and the allusions that you mentioned, as well as the fig tree, it actually led me to a passage in Micah 4. And it reads like this: "In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of mountains, and shall be raised up above the hills." Mountains, that's where Moses met God all the time. "People shall stream to it, and many nations shall come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall come forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many peoples, and arbitrate between the strong nations far away. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But they shall all sit under their own vines and under their own fig trees. And no one shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken it." I think this story points back to this prophecy of the day of the Lord that they were waiting for. And what comes with the day of the Lord but the Messiah, Jesus? Now we hear in this passage this idea of judging and arbitrating, and we might think of that as negative. But the way it is meant in the Old Testament has more to do with putting things right, to taking things that are broken, things that are not working, injustices, and making them right again. Beating their swords into plowshares, making these weapons of destruction into implements of production. No longer meant to destroy, but instead to create, to feed, to be a part of the table that allows people to gather together. Not learning war, not training to kill, but instead sitting under the vines and the fig trees. These plants that would take years to grow before they would even produce anything can only be used and utilized in times of peace and prosperity. Times when people no longer battled each other, but came together around a table of peace, of wholeness, of shalom. And as a result, they can live unafraid. So it wasn't that Jesus had some sort of magnetism to him, that all these people were attracted to him. It was that Jesus was tapping into something, that Jesus was setting them up for that home run, for that hole-in-one, by connecting to their heritage, to their shared faith, to this hope that they all shared. And we know that even though things weren't always perfect for the disciples, that Jesus, the Messiah, was ushering in a new age, and the disciples, and therefore us, all of us here, are in for quite a wild ride. It's amazing how the things these people had in common helped them to discover the Messiah Jesus in profound ways. I've always thought it was a little weird how quickly these guys followed Jesus, but it turns out they were primed and they were made ready for this experience with Jesus.
Clayton, yes, exactly. And that's why it's so important for us to know these stories, to make them a part of our lives rather than just up here in the head. So that when Jesus passes by, we know the stories and we'll notice and follow him.
And we must also remember about how the discovery was almost contagious. I suppose when you've been waiting for someone to show up for generations, it's hard to keep it to yourself. The circle just kept expanding, and these stories that we have here are just the beginning.
Yes, as we see in Acts and also in the letters of the beloved Paul, this experience continues on throughout the early church. Our own Anabaptist story is one of showing and sharing our faith. One might even say that Jesus went viral long before all the social media that we see today.
That's true, Gordon. Sometimes the technology we use can be a crutch. I wonder what it might be like if we were as eager as these disciples to share the story of Jesus in our lives. Maybe we'd use some different words and some different stories that connect us, but I think we've all experienced Jesus in profound ways, and we could share that with our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers.
Perhaps that becomes part of our work as followers of Jesus. That is, finding common language and stories that inspire radical transformation.
And fill ourselves with the stories of the Bible. Let's not forget that. We not only preach and read about Jesus, but we also enact the rituals of remembrance. And communion is one of those tangible ways that we can relive the story, and we can look back on what Jesus has done for us, and we can look forward to see what Jesus will continue to do among us.